Welcome to the Church with No Walls podcast.
Today we're interviewing Dana Lockhart, who is the pastor of Faith Lutheran Church in Lexington, Kentucky. Dana, thank you for taking a little time to join me on the podcast.
Great to be here and good to see you again, Ryan.
It's good to see you. Me and Dana have known each other for a couple of decades. Me and Dana went to college together. He was actually my resident assistant at Western Kentucky University. So he was one of the people that guided a young Ryan during my first experience with college. So it's good to see him and catch up with him. We've been talking offline a little bit, just catching up, but I'm glad to see you looking well. You haven't aged a day.
Oh yeah,
you look the exact same.
Okay, well,
so Dana, you have been a religious leader for basically since you graduated college, correct?
So right. So after I left Western, I went and I was pursuing, and yeah, this is like very reminiscent of the actual pandemic, because I'm sitting in my living room in a clerical collar recording on Zoom, like I did 100, 200 times for services, and like I'm living in mortal fear that my dog is going to act up. She will be silent. Like that whole time we were talking and setting things up, she was silent. And then like the minute I start talking, she just started growling. So
well, if she wants to be a part of it, she can as well.
It's just kind of crazy to me. You know, the animals of Zoom was one of the ongoing lovely things about our time healthy at home, right? You know, cats walking across keyboards, dogs barking, all the crazy stuff. Anyways, so when I left Western, I was a double major in German and religious studies, and I thought I would pursue an academic career in German, and I got a master's at UK in German, but along the way I got involved with the Lutheran Episcopal Campus Ministry at UK, and just very early on I had a real fascination in religion, had been a religious studies major at Western, and then was kind of encouraged to consider a seminary career, which at the time it was like, me, pastor, that doesn't really make sense. And then what I found was, deep in my heart, I had this calling and I hadn't figured out yet how to express it. And then I'm meeting with a campus minister, and he's like, have you ever considered seminary? And so I left Western and went to Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Columbus, Ohio, and got a master's in divinity, and was ordained in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and served churches in South Dakota, and then came back actually to be the campus minister at the University of Kentucky. And through that relationship between the Lutheran Church and the Episcopal Church, I was invited to be a candidate for a call to St. John's Episcopal Church in Versailles, Kentucky, which was a congregational call. And because of the ecumenical relationships between the ELCA and the Episcopal Church, I understand this for your listeners, this is really inside baseball, I get it, but I just want to explain, because we have this agreement and we share ministries, and I had been going and being a substitute pastor in both Lutheran congregations and Episcopal congregations. When they wanted to do a search process at St. John's, I was invited. I had actually gone there one time, filled in, somehow preached one of the best sermons of my career. I don't even know how that happened. They remembered me. The next thing I knew, I was invited to go and serve there as their priest in charge, which I always joke about, because priest in charge was like the best job title in the world. I wasn't technically an Episcopal priest, and most of the time I certainly wasn't in charge, right? So I served at St. John's, and that's where I was throughout the pandemic, kind of from February of 2020, we when we started hearing the rumblings and the sense that something could come through the church closures and all of that. So, and since then, I've taken a call to Faith Lutheran in Lexington. So I'm back, not straddling two denominations. I'm back home in the ELCA and hoping to serve the people at Faith well. So
you're very well traveled and very well, educated in leading a church and understanding the nuances. So prior to the pandemic, we'll go back a little bit. So prior to the pandemic, how much of a role did media, whether it was social media, whether it was like a live stream or a videotaping services and putting them out there on DVD for people, how much did that play in what you did at any of your stops as a pastor or just whatever churches you were affiliated with? It, how much was that a thing?
Right. Well, yeah, and that's a great question. And I don't know how much background it would really be helpful for this, but one of the realities of being a millennial church leader in kind of mainline Protestant Christianity is, I mean, I'm 40 now, and I've been regularly part of church leadership meetings for 16 years, and I'm still often the youngest person in the room. So just like I was when I was 24, right? 23, it is just the demographics of this particular corner of the church. And so I can remember being very young and on a college campus as a graduate student and going to church meetings and trying to tell people around the room like about this new thing called Facebook. And they just looked at me like I was crazy. Because at the time, Facebook, you had to have a .edu account to have a Facebook profile. And I was like, if you want to reach young people, you got to find someone on in your congregation, a faculty member, an alumnus, a current student, and get on Facebook. And it was very weird how fast it went from that being a very exotic, kind of abstract, kind of, this is just a kid talking about something crazy, to suddenly everybody being on Facebook, and actually so many people, so many parents and grandparents getting on Facebook that it was no longer cool to be on Facebook. So I lived through that transition. And along the way, that involved doing things like in the churches that I served in South Dakota, going in 2011 and 2012 and really setting up some of the first Facebook accounts for those churches and creating those online communities, which was very helpful. When I was in South Dakota, there was a major blizzard, the Atlas blizzard, that wiped out power. It was this huge national emergency and or natural disaster. And Facebook, because all the phone lines were down, but the cell phone tower still worked. Facebook then became the way for these churches. I was serving 4 churches at the time. They were very remote places in ranching communities, but Facebook became the primary means of keeping the community together and keeping in contact with people, because roads were impassable. Lots of people didn't have power. It took several weeks for any sense of normalcy to be restored after that storm. And that was kind of a precursor of the power of social media for religious communities. And that kind of, as I look back, that's like the prequel to what ended up happening during the pandemic. So then I was in campus media. That was when I was in campus ministry. Of course, I felt like half my life was on social media because we used I used Facebook mostly to communicate to constituents, donors, some with students, but more alumni and other supporters of the campus ministry. And then we used things like GroupMe and other platforms. Yik Yak was really popular at UK at the time, and I can remember just thinking, this is a fascinating glimpse into what's going on in this community, because like the early days of the internet, Yik Yak was completely anonymous, and it was often utterly like an utter sewer. But you could be, as a campus minister, in the middle of this college campus and pull up Yik Yak and see kind of what people are really talking about, what they're really thinking, what the opinions are that are getting aired. And that was a fascinating experience too. And then obviously they ran into a lot of trouble, and I don't even know if it's a thing anymore. And so when I got back into the parish, I really didn't want to do anything with social media, because as a campus minister, I felt like I had done so much virtual ministry, so much connecting with people, that when I went to St. John's, they were a very traditional congregation. They had some Anglo-Catholic aspirations. And so it was very much an embodied experience. It was very much prayer books and pews and kneelers. We used torches for our processions every Sunday. There was a choir. There was incense on high holy days. There were sanctus bells. It was literally smells and bells kind of worship. Every other Sunday, we used the Rite One out of the Book of Common Prayer, which is Elizabethan language, which was a lot to learn how to use as a minister, but I muddled through. But it was very much the focus of this worship experience is being in the moment, preserving traditions of the church, using liturgy and rites that had been used for centuries, if not millennia, with elements of the service dating back, as far back as we can date Christian history. And for a while, I was really comfortable with that. And then, bam, March 2020, and suddenly you have to go from being a fully embodied church with very little electronic presence, like a rudimentary website, a Facebook page that people occasionally post to, but that is the minister you could pretty much ignore. They would record my sermons and post them in batches. So sometimes they'd get uploaded weekly, just the audio files, but then sometimes it'd be like a whole month at a time, just depending on the volunteers. But it was only audio files. It was only on the website. And I don't know how many people listened to it. We didn't really track that. But it was not focused at all on technology. Now we've got to find a way to be an entirely virtual church.
So literally, outside of the audio recordings and just, kind of what you were already doing, being socially active on Facebook and other social media to engage members. If you miss Sunday, if you miss service, you missed service. There, you weren't gonna, right. You were all of the pomp and circumstance of stuff that you all do, like you said, you're not going to be able to replicate that. There is no way to. You can't turn on your YouTube at that point and say, okay, I get to see everything happening through this service.
Right. No, and in a way, I think it wasn't. So I think it was like a collision of a couple of things. One was when I first got to St. John's, for instance, the office had this legacy internet connection. that someone had signed up for in the mid 2000s. And so they were paying a lot of money for 1 megabyte per second. And that was high speed. And I was like, this is not high speed, guys. And so we had to, like, we switched to a mainline provider because they were using a provider that had kind of popped up in the late 90s, early 2000s, before the larger companies had really moved into commercial and small business internet. And so to switch to a mainline provider, all of a sudden we were bumped up, I think, to 50 megabytes per second for half the money. And even then, I can remember being in a church meeting and someone was like, well, do we have to go from 1 to 50? Can maybe we get like 10? And I'm like, guys, that would have been a great conversation to have 10 years ago, but like, we just signed up for the lowest tier that is offered to small businesses, and it's saving us money. So like, let's have a little extra bandwidth. And that was 2017 when I got into the office and was like, the church secretary and I cannot be on our computers at the same time because the internet is just too slow. And so we upgraded that. And so some of it was just congregations get in grooves, and some congregations are very innovative and some are very traditional. And I was definitely in a congregation that was more on the traditional side of things. And also just the age, I think the age differences has always been a factor, right? Awareness of technology, openness to technology, some kind of understanding of the pitfalls, and also the promises of technology.
So sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. So what is like the age range that your membership falls into?
Right. Well, so of course, in a congregation, you'll have examples of, like, you'll have the full gamut, right? From very small children to very elderly people. However, there tends to be more representation for people who are kind of baby boomers into silent generation. And so the median age for a lot of these congregations is 60 plus, right? And that presents its own kind of unique challenges and also benefits. I mean, on the one hand, it's nice to have a lot of retired people. They've got a lot of skills. They've got a lot of time. And so they're very efficient leaders. On the other hand, it's always interesting because these age gaps develop. And so in a lot of times in talking about technology in my career, I'm still that kid who's like, hey, if you want to reach young people, why don't we try X? And everyone looks at me like, why would we do that? That's the dumbest thing we've ever heard. Or that's just a fad that's going to go away. And some things are, I mean, like I said, I mean, my first year in campus ministry as a campus minister, Yik Yak was huge, and then it went away. I mean, there are things that are fads, but as we've seen, technology is not a fad. Like, the internet is not going away. You love it, hate it. It's not going away. It changes over time, and you have to have some sort of digital awareness. And then there's also this sense in which you can see, and I think our generation, because we grew up with technology, but not in the same way that I think the younger generations are. Like, I was 18 before I got my first cell phone. I remember life before everyone had cell phones. But I also always there was always a computer in the classroom, right? Like, I don't remember a time before using computers was a common thing. And that's an interesting perspective, because there's often a lot of fear about technology, and you can tell the difference between people who grew up sort of as digital natives from those who didn't. Oftentimes in church conversations, people will talk about kind of the pitfalls of social media, and people posting things that are wrong or inflammatory or controversial, or and we got to be careful about what we put out there. And I'm just sitting here like, I never ever, years of campus ministry, never had a problem with a student posting something inappropriate, because they grew up with it, right? Who are the people who are creating the problems online? It's the it's the older people who suddenly, they haven't had enough time to think through this or to learn about this or to really, it's always going to be a second language to some people, I think, in the church. So that's kind of a long answer to your question, but that's kind of where I see age and generations in terms of technology, at least from my congregational leadership experience, is always having to keep in mind that these things are new, somewhat foreign, perhaps a little scary to a significant part of a congregation's leadership.
Makes sense. I mean, you bring up a lot of good points, and some of those we'll touch back on towards as we go through this. So you're going along, you've kind of upgraded a little bit of the media for your church. Then the pandemic hits.
Yeah.
What was the first bells ringing in your head, or the first conversations you had with, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to continue to get our message out to our members? Are we going to continue on with services and just do them virtually? Are we going to shut down for a little while? What were those conversations? What were those thought processes in your head? Because you're the leader, you're the one that they're looking to. And during that point, like you said, you were priest in charge of another church. So it wasn't even necessarily your home church. You were filling the shoes of somebody else. So what was going through your head and your thoughts at that point?
Well, it's funny, like that whole time period was crazy, because immediately before we were asked to not have in-person worship, like 2 weeks earlier, we had a professional development conference in the Episcopal Diocese of Lexington that I attended, and they had brought in a preaching professor, and this preaching professor had encouraged all of us to videotape our sermons and watch them afterwards to get back into the habit. That's something that you do in preaching lab in seminary. You record sermons, you get critique, you get feedback from the professor, from TAs, from your peers. And then I'm the kind of person, like, I sat there listening to this advice thinking, I am never going to record another one of my sermons. Like, I just don't want to do it. I don't like my face on the camera. I don't like listening to the sound of my own voice. Why would I ever do this? Never going to do it. And then literally 2 weeks later, that would be, recording was the only way I could preach. It was the only way that I could teach. It was the only way I could minister. And it was this whirlwind experience. So I was at a doctor's appointment on a Wednesday, and got a text that Governor Beshear was asking all of the churches not to hold in-person worship for the following 2 weeks. And that was something that we had not anticipated. We knew that COVID was out there. There was some very early reports. I had actually been at a conference in Louisville for Episcopal congregations. This national conference seat had been in Louisville, and there'd been a couple of cases of COVID that had come out of that conference. But we were anticipating needing more safety procedures. But the idea of not having church in person was this radical idea that honestly I hadn't anticipated. I mean, getting hand sanitizer in every pew, that I had anticipated. Changing some of how we, not passing the peace, changing some communion protocols, that was something that I had envisioned, because we had done things like that before for severe cases of the flu. but to suddenly get a member of the church council texting me saying, hey, did you hear this? And I'm sitting here like, I have no idea. Do the doctor's appointment, pull up the internet on my phone, and then just, well, what do we do? And that was the first initial question, because this is Wednesday, and one of the realities of being in professional ministry is Sunday comes every week. So there's not a lot of time to make a plan, and we plan things far in advance. So we're in Lent in my tradition, and our plans for Holy Week, which were a couple of weeks later, were already set. We had our Easter preparations made, and that suddenly was all thrown into question, because this isn't just like, it didn't hit on a Sunday in, the middle of June when half the people are on vacation. This was go time. Just like it was, I think, for college sports, like they're canceling March Madness, right? Because that's the peak season. All of a sudden, we're like, they could potentially cancel Easter. Like, what do you do? How do you respond? And so we waited for instructions from our bishop, and then did make the decision to voluntarily close. And I had two colleagues close by who were part of churches that, for that initial Sunday, after the governor asked for voluntary closures for 2 weeks to flatten the curve, did hold in-person services. And I remember reaching out to both of them and saying, you're making it harder on the rest of us, because if my church voluntarily closes and yours doesn't, then anyone in my church that thinks this is all silly and we should be in person is going to point to your church and say, well, if they're open, why aren't we? And initially there was this fear that even churches that were in very close communion, that were in the same denomination, the same diocese, the same synod, the same conference, would suddenly be put into competition with one another because it was voluntary. And so are you following the governor's recommendations, or are you not? Are you still having in-person worship, or are you not? And then I had a particular fear that if enough churches didn't voluntarily close, that the government was going to order us to close, which I was very uncomfortable with. Like, the whole idea that we would get to that point was something that really weighed on me. So yeah, there were some really tough conversations about whether to close, whether or not to close, and what to do. And then if you did make the decision to close, what do you replace it with? Because you only have a couple of days, and you're also in these set routines where communities kind of function. People have their roles. For a church service at St. John's, that would regularly involve a dozen people in the active participation of making that service happen. And all of these people had been trained. This was part of their faith. This was part of how they expressed their love for God. And now all of a sudden they're saying, well, you can't have more than 10 people and don't gather and worship. And what happens to all of those roles? And then also, how do you replace them? And then also, so it was a very fascinating time and a very stressful time. And unfortunately, eventually the health department and the state and the governor did issue an order for the church to close, which I think is a whole nother conversation about, I felt at the time, and I still do, if you have voluntary compliance from like 98% of the churches, why go after the 2% that are just being really stubborn about this? Like, I thought that might have been a miscalculation by the health departments and the governor, but I can also see things from their point of view. It emerged really early on that church was a place of unique risk, that singing, being in close proximity, sharing communion together, passing the peace, that church communities posed a risk. And there was the church in Washington where their choir rehearsal, and that was very much a fear in the back of all of our minds. Like when I would talk with my colleagues, is nothing had prepared us for the reality of, if we don't do the right thing here, people could die. Right?
Yeah. It's a heavy burden to have to put on. And like you said, with such a short amount of time to figure out what is the right decision, especially in that moment. So 2 questions. One, how many people generally attended your service post-pandemic? And then secondly, when this initially happened, were you looking at this as okay, this is a short term, a couple weeks that the governor said we're going to shut these down, but then in a couple of weeks we'll be back to what we're doing, maybe a month, or did you look at it, okay, there's possibility of a longer game here that we're going to have to play?
Right. Yeah. Those are good questions. And I'll try to keep my answers short. Like, I hope like when you interview a pastor, you kind of get long-worded answers. I don't know, at least when you interview this pastor.
No, I knew what I was doing when I got into this, that I've never met a pastor that keeps it within the 20 or 30 minutes that they say they're gonna preach. So
Right.
It's so I expected, but no, it's good information. It's great for our audience to hear. So go right ahead.
So let me get to the first question there, which I've now forgotten.
Which is like how many people
attendance
usually come to a service, an average number of people you would see, whether it's the people that are part of it or just everybody involved. Like how many did you average pre-pandemic?
So pre-pandemic, St. John's was right at 100. Had 2 services on Sundays and then a Wednesday service, but Sunday morning, between the early service at 8 and then the later service at 10, there'd be about 100 people. So 20 at one, 80 at the other, 15 at one, 85 at the other. And there were some ups and downs depending on the church year. Summer lower attendance, high holy days, on Easter it would consistently be above 200, and so that's the size of the community that I was pastoring during the pandemic. And I think looking back, historians are going to find some really fascinating documentation about those early days, because I can remember there was a lot of hope that this would be a short-term thing, and that if we shut down the churches for the last couple of weeks of Lent, we would still be able to gather at Easter. That was initially my hope, and it gradually set in that this was going to be a far longer experience. And there were pastoral letters from bishops that we would see. For example, there was another bishop, not my bishop, but another bishop, who went ahead and, when it looked like Easter may not happen, declared, okay, congregations will be allowed to celebrate the festival of Easter in person this summer, right? And it was this idea of, okay, so initially it was 2 weeks, then it was 4 weeks, then it looked like it was 2 months, and it took a long time for people, I think, for the whole system to adapt to the idea that this actually might be a multi-year thing with various levels of in-person, out of person, online, all of that. It took a long time for that idea to really settle in, because I think we all hoped, if everyone just stays home and that COVID would disappear, which wasn't necessarily an irrational fear, because actually, if you look at SARS and MERS that had happened beforehand, they had been able to contain it so that it didn't become a worldwide pandemic. And I would say March of 2020, that was what was the optimism in my heart. We are not going to have to go. This is going to be a blip. And then as we get into April of 2020, it starts to become obvious that this virus is going to be with us for a while. So
as you're realizing this is going to be a longer process than you thought, that this could be, like you said, multi-year, this could be the new reality.
Right.
When do you start to go into the, okay, well, we've been, you said, I'm never going to record services. You had heard, right. You had said that weeks prior, never going to record services. Prior.
Like,
when did it become a reality that, okay, I'm going to have to start maybe looking at these methods of, whether it's live streaming, whether it's doing something so that way these services do get to our members, so that way our members don't lose touch with us? Because obviously you're on social media with them, but how do we continue to move forward without losing them and, losing the momentum of the church?
Right. No, that's a great question. I can remember being really frustrated at times with the role I was placed into to try to keep things going. And I remember somewhat resentfully saying at one point, when they had the Spanish flu pandemic and churches closed, like no one expected the pastor to like send out his sermon by Morse code, right? Like the idea of, can we actually shut down was the first question, right? Does every congregation have to do something to replace an in-person gathering? Or is it okay if there's a pause or a break in the worship continuity of this community? And very early on, it seemed apparent that everyone had to do something, in part because that's faithful, right? We want to continue to worship God. We want to continue to gather on Sundays in whatever way we can. And we have communities that need to stay together in whatever way that we can. We don't want to lose momentum. But there was also just manifestly it just hits you in the face really early on that different communities were equipped differently to meet these challenges. So we had, I had congregations that were serving churches in rural Appalachia that didn't have reliable cell phone service or internet in their churches. So their response to the pandemic was, or in some cases, had really very poor internet even in their homes, right? Like, technology is not evenly distributed in every community. Larger congregations, I think, some of them had made investments in technology that smaller congregations couldn't afford. Platforms, trying to figure out which platforms to use, because there are so many different ones. So a lot of, and then when you think through, how do we do this? Because there's a lot of different ways. What we did initially at St. John's was we decided to record services. And that was the best way to preserve all of the elements of the rite and to try to make it the most authentic experience that you could have at home. And so we would gather in small groups, we'd be distanced, we'd wear masks, and we bought a bunch of different iPads, and it was very much like suddenly I wasn't leading a worship service. I was part of a film crew, and we would have cut lists, and there would be scenes, and you do this part and that part, and it wasn't necessarily in order. And part of that was nice, because if someone made a mistake, you could be like, oh, okay, let's redo that. Let's do that over again. But it changed the experience for the people who could participate, because suddenly it wasn't leading a service that started and ended and was this organic experience, this organic thing. It was fragmented and somewhat artificial, and then pieced together with video software. And what we were able to produce for a small congregation was amazing. I had a church organist, Owen Salmons, who is now at a larger church in Louisville, and it's just fantastically brilliant. And what very early on figured out film editing, brought some of that technology information, some of that expertise, had the aesthetic sensibility to be able to do some of these things. And so we were able to do some really, what I felt were high quality video services. And then we realized there's just no way we can keep doing this.
So now did you guys have to buy equipment, or did you guys already have the equipment that basically you just utilized?
So what we realized really early on was the equipment we had wasn't good enough. We upgraded the internet in the church again. We bought iPads, we bought mics, we bought editing software, we bought Zoom, Zoom subscriptions. And early on, it was the question of like, how long is this going to last? Because it's a significant investment for a church community. So it's sort of like, if this is only going to be 10 weeks, then maybe if we spend, a couple of $1,000, that's worth it. But we don't need to get into big ticket items.
Right.
But then the longer it went, the more you realize the only way we can make this sustainable is to invest in technology. That's it. Like, we need equipment, because that was the reality that smacked us in the face with recording the services. Is what we wanted to do was offer something that was very high quality and beautiful, but to do that required 18 to 20 hours of video editing, and there was no way that anyone on the church staff could devote that much amount of time to do that week after week after week after week after week. And so we looked to what other options. We did services only on Zoom for a while, which cut out a lot of the editing, because we could do them simultaneously. People could log on, but then we could also record the video and then upload the video so people can watch them, asynchronously. Like they could watch them whenever they wanted to, or they could participate at the actual worship time. And that worked for a while, but Zoom was very low quality, and people were doing Zoom for everything else in their life. And so gradually we realized, okay, this isn't we've gone too far on the other end, right? We set the bar too high in trying to produce essentially a movie a week of church, and then it was too low just doing Zoom church. So what we did then was we decided, okay, what if we did live streaming that could also be recorded like Zoom? But what if we upgraded everything so that we could put it on Facebook, we could put it on YouTube, people could watch it while it was happening, but then watch it later if they didn't want to watch it while it was happening, so that it had the benefits of Zoom, but we were in the church building, we had better cameras, we had better mics, we had better everything, and so that it wasn't just people sitting in their living rooms, like with my dog barking and someone's cat walking across the keyboard. And so we decided to do that, but that required some significant upgrades in technology. And the first problem that we ran into is St. John's was just celebrated 175 years. So it's a historic congregation. The building was built in stages. So the oldest part of the building was the foundation under the main church, which was from the 1840s. The main church itself was from the 1880s. So it's this Victorian structure. There were these additions that were put on in the 1930s. And then there were some additional, there was a small addition put on in the 1960s. And like a lot of historic churches, each one of these stages looks lovely, but it also resulted in things like 3 different basements that didn't connect to one another, a crawl space, attic crawl spaces that didn't connect to one another, plaster walls. So it was not conducive at all. We would bring in technicians from, Spectrum or Metronet, and try to figure out, like, how do I get internet? Like, how do I get Wi-Fi from the office, which is at one end of this building, into the nave, which is at the other end, through all of these walls and a courtyard and brick walls and plaster walls. And what we realized is there was no way to get reliable internet and no easy way to wire, to run a wire, because things just didn't connect to one another. So we ended up having to purchase this huge amount of cable and actually go out the window in the office, around the building,
Wow,
through a window in the sacristy, tape down on the floor into the nave.
Wow.
Like, that's how we got internet into the sanctuary. Like, that's what we had to do to get a reliable internet signal that was strong enough for live streaming. And when people weren't attending in person, we were able to do a lot of things. Like, it was set up, suddenly your church becomes a film studio, because we had temporary cameras and temporary microphones, and everything was taped down, and there was wires everywhere. And that worked really well for a time, because we had fewer than 10 people at all times. And Owen was smart enough and motivated enough and had the skills that he was able to do virtual choir pieces, because that was the other thing. Like, singing's important, but singing's dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you preserve the music of the church, the music of the liturgy? And so our choir began to meet, and they would record individual pieces, and they were so brave to do it, because, I mean, literally they'd have the music on a device, they'd have that in their ear listening to it, and then they would have to sing by themselves. And so what became a communal experience suddenly became a very individualized experience in singing. And then all those voices were then melded together to produce a virtual choir piece. And those were beautiful, but they they required a lot of editing. They required a lot of recording time, and we needed to have people who were brave enough, because it's a very different experience to stand there and sing with a bunch of your friends all at once versus to be in a room by yourself recording a vocal track by yourself. It's very, we had to make those transitions. I don't know. I'm doing a lot of talking, Ryan. I don't know.
Oh, you're good. And it would seem, as we're kind of transitioning on to another phase of it, these people, your choir, your people that are taking time out of their, obviously life is pretty much paused because of the pandemic. So some may be working virtually from home, some may not be working at all, but it seems like it's become a full-time job for, not only obviously it's your full-time job,
Right.
but it's a full-time job for everybody else involved to make this process happen. For one Sunday morning service, which may range for an hour, a couple hours, depending on how long your service is, this has now become multiple hours of shooting, of editing, of figuring out how to do these different things. Like you mentioned, it being like a film set, it literally takes on a different feel. And I would imagine that it becomes less like a religious experience, but more of a process, of a means to an end for an audience that you're hoping is going to log on and watch it and engage and get something from it, as opposed to when they come in on Sunday, you can see the instantaneous, they're being lifted in the spirit, they're becoming a part of the service. You're hoping that all of this work transitions into something that the audience that's tuning in will be engaged in. Am I correct?
Right. Well, yeah. And then there's the workload changed. It was oftentimes very overwhelming. We were blessed in the Episcopal Diocese of Lexington that the diocese itself recognized that technology wasn't the same for every church, and that this was producing a particular burden on congregations. And so the diocese itself decided, okay, we're going to produce one Sunday a month, a diocesan-wide worship video, and congregations would be invited to contribute a piece. But essentially, we were, for a while there, able to say, okay, the last Sunday of the month is going to be the diocesan service. And so then we could pause to catch our breath, because otherwise it was just drinking from a fire hose the whole rest of the time. And as we go through those phases, like early on, okay, produce a couple of videos. This is going to be a lot of work, but it's a short time thing. Let's just do the best we can. Then, you transition into, that's not sustainable, so let's do Zoom. Okay, that's also not sustainable, so let's try to do live stream. Eventually we get to the place where we realize whatever we do next, it has to be something that will work for years, which was a total change in thought process. It took a long time for all the leaders to get on board with that this was not going to be a temporary thing, that we needed to think that restrictions could happen for a long time, and also to begin to think about, okay, we suddenly have all these people watching online. Do they all come back in person? And that was an open question, and it's still an open question, right? Because I think every church that's still doing an online service still has people who are really primarily or exclusively attending the online service. And what does that mean? And then there was some pushback. There was always, I think, some pushback that if you just move all online, then people will be less likely to come and worship in person. So shouldn't we have a plan to shut all of this down? And that was that was a lot of questions going back and forth when we started talking about putting in permanent fixtures, like cameras that weren't just on camera stands that could be knocked over if there were more than 10 people in the building. When we started talking about upgrading the sound system and putting in a permanent control booth. For a small congregation, I think we ended up making an investment somewhere in the ballpark of $50,000 when it was all said and done. And we ran into immediate supply chain issues. Like our initial order of technology, I think, was in June of 2020, and it didn't actually get delivered because of all the supply chain issues until right before Christmas, which was a great time to suddenly change your whole suddenly have installers and everything and running wires. And we didn't actually get all of the technology in until after Easter of 2021, and then had to train people how to use it. And so it's this huge investment of time. It's this huge investment of money. But we had to find a way, because the question at the time was, is virtual church going to be with us forever?
Right.
And early on at St. John's, we saw the promise of social media. You might remember, like, all of a sudden there was like toilet paper shortages everywhere.
Right. Yes. Everything was gone.
Everything was gone. And that was causing some people to really panic. And so one of the things we did at St. John's is I was just sitting in my office one day and the whole building's closed. Like, I'm the only one there. And I look around and I realize we have months worth of toilet paper that's sitting here, and we're probably not going to be we have no use for it because we're not going to be reopened. And so I just took 20 or 30 rolls and put them on a table on the sidewalk in front of the building, and put a sign up that just said, basically, like, hoarding is a sin, right? And because that was the concern at the time, that people were going out and were buying all or grabbing all they could. And I said, take a roll or two as you need.
Yeah.
And then I took a photo of that, because the only way to communicate to anyone who wasn't walking by the church was to use social media. And man, the next thing I knew, my little church, like, we had like 25,000 views within a week of that, just that photo that got out, and it got shared everywhere. And then there was a guy, a local man who had a YouTube channel, and he came by and filmed all about it. And that went out to all of the people who watched his stuff. And this became, it was like, that wasn't necessarily what I wanted my church to be known for, the toilet paper church. But then it was kind of amazing, because I could sit there at my office and look out the window and watch. And there were days in the pandemic, like, I would have to go out and like restock every hour because people were coming by, because there just wasn't, there was nothing in Kroger. And every time they got a shipment, it was gone within an hour. I mean, gone, in less than an hour. And suddenly we also realized we had a Cisco account, and all of the office buildings were closed, so they weren't ordering toilet paper. And this is probably more about toilet paper than you want to hear, Ryan. But this is the kind of fascinating stuff that happened during the pandemic. Is we realized that there were two different markets for toilet paper. One was industrial toilet paper for office buildings, and one was residential. That was the stuff you bought at Kroger.
Yeah.
Stuff you bought at Kroger, no one could get. But the industrial stuff, we could order as much of it as we wanted. So we just started ordering like cases and cases and cases of toilet paper and giving it out to whoever needed it.
Wow.
Because there was this moment in time where, because we could order in bulk from a commercial supplier, we could get something that no one else could get. And then we wanted to bless our community with it. And so that became like because once it went viral, like initially what I thought was, I've got a couple of cases of toilet paper and I'll give it away over a couple of days and that'll be it. But then all of a sudden it was like, nope, I got to put in another $1,000 order because we're handing this stuff out so fast. And we sent some to a homeless shelter that was having similar problems acquiring needed supplies, and we just tried to figure out, well, what can we do in this time to still be the church? And that was one of the things that we did. So out of that experience, we began to realize we do have an audience. There are like not just our little congregation, but there's a lot of other people who are finding out about our church, and people are watching, and people are tuning in from elsewhere, and long-term members who had moved away are suddenly watching again. And so then the thought was, okay, what if this is really a golden opportunity? I mean, I think as Christians, just to get a little theological for a moment, I hope that's okay.
Absolutely.
But like, if God transforms crucifixion, which is a horrible, terrible crime, worst of the worst criminals, people who were, insurrectionists, it was meant to be humiliating and painful. And the cross itself is an instrument of torture and death. And if God transforms that into a powerful sign of resurrection, new life, of the triumph of love over hate, the triumph of mercy over punishment, the triumph of eternal life over death, then I think as Christians we can look into everything that God will bring something good and something beautiful out of even our hardest experiences. And so there started to be all this conversation of, this presents an opportunity for us that were congregations that had declining attendance for a number of years to be able to better serve our own community, and then also to reach out beyond our walls. That my little church in Versailles, Kentucky, where with all the work and the effort and the beauty and the architecture and the music would have only been available to 100 people who could physically come on Sunday, suddenly we could reach anywhere in the world. And what does that look like? And how do we steward that? How do we nurture that? How do we grow that? And that opened up, I think, some really fruitful conversations. And it kind of goes in two ways. Like, in the one way, there was a lot of sense of audience chasing, right? Because we weren't the only congregation that was doing that, right? Like every little church in America was doing that.
Right.
So, and there's only so many eyeballs. And it wasn't just like we were doing it. We were also now competing, because I would have members who'd be like, well, what you're doing on Sunday is nice, but we really like to watch the National Cathedral. And I'm like, oh my Lord, we can't compete against them. Like,
Right.
They've got so much more money, more staff, more everything. And so then that opened up fruitful conversations for not just audience chasing, like how do we grow bigger and bigger numbers, but then also, well, we had homebound parishioners who we would visit, and we would bring them the Holy Eucharist, and we would talk with them and bring them a church bulletin. But that was the extent of their connection to the congregation, because they couldn't physically come. And now, all of a sudden, whenever they felt like it, they could watch the service, They could see their friends, they could hear their music, they could see their church. And we could connect with them in ways that we never could before. And so it wasn't just like, how do we grow our audience and reach new people? It was also, this is going to open up platforms and opportunities for us to serve our existing community better. So I think a lot of good things came out of it. It was just tremendously, like, when you're going through it, I never want to go through this again, Ryan. Like, I never, please, never, ever,
Right.
ever again. But in a really beautiful way, we were able to find some silver linings and some opportunities in the midst of tremendous turmoil and disruption.
Be sure to tune in for the second half of our interview. Take care and be blessed.